Every loyal citizen of the United States owes New Jersey a grudge. Jersey has been bought and sold both at home and abroad. The state is owned and governed today by a syndicate representing the capitalists of Newark, Philadelphia, New York, London, and Amsterdam. New Jersey sold us out for money. She passed her miscellaneous incorporation acts for revenue. Her citizens pay no direct state tax. The corporations pay all the expenses of the state and more. It was good business, but it was bribery, the bribery of a whole state. If there is such a thing as treason by a state, then New Jersey is a traitor state.
The muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens used those harsh words to describe the political corruption in New Jersey in 1906. Steffens was not alone in wanting to reform New Jersey's soiled reputation as a state controlled by a corrupt alliance between political bosses and big corporations. In both the Republican and Democratic parties, reformers came forward to rally behind the progressive banner.
As American industry matured, the primitive concept of unrestrained competition was perceived to be less than a blessing. Monopolies of the sort enjoyed by the Camden and Amboy barons looked far more soothing to the nerves and beneficial to the wallet. The answer was the trust, a combination that organized groups of companies in a single industry into a monolith that set wages and prices. A nationwide revolt against these tactics began in the late 1880s. State after state passed antitrust laws. But New Jersey once more displayed its talent for marching to its own special drum. It not only refused to pass an antitrust law, it authorized holding corporations, giant combines, uniquely suited to issuing large amounts of common stock, which simplified the takeover of other companies. Standard Oil absorbed the oil industry for John D. Rockefeller under the generous provisions of New Jersey's laws. Hundreds of other corporations rushed to imitate the performance. The costs were modest. All that was needed was a one-room home office and a few pieces of paper from the state, purchased for 20 cents on each $1,000 of capitalization. The big jolt to New Jersey's bosses and their business backers came from the most unexpected place in the most unexpected way. In 1901, a young Irish Catholic undertaker named Mark Fagan ran for mayor of Jersey City on the Republican ticket. Jersey City was governed by an unsavory alliance between E.F.C. Young, president of the First National Bank, and Little Bob Davis, the Democratic boss. Running against bossism and in favor of such basic services as efficient police and fire protection, Fagan stunned the city and the state by beating the Democratic boss and his banker partner. With the assistance of Corporation Counsel George L. Record, Fagan submitted to the legislature a program proposing equal taxation and a limitation on public utilities. The legislature ignored him. The infuriated Fagan responded with an open letter of protest against corporation control of the Republican Party. This bombshell exploded across the state with startling effects. It launched the New Idea movement, which soon attracted outspoken and independent Republicans. The success of Fagan and record in Jersey City inspired dozens of other Republicans and Democrats to join the New Idea movement, which soon blossomed into the New Jersey version of the progressive movement. But the New Idea men were promising more than they could deliver. In the primary elections of 1906, Republican regulars routed the New Idea men everywhere. In 1910, with the leaders of the New Idea beaten to the political sidelines, the Republicans decided they could go back to a safe, conservative governor. Democratic bosses were thinking along the same lines. James Smith of Essex and Robert Davis of Hudson decided they would be happy with a college president named Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was not just any college president. He was president of Princeton. There he had led a widely publicized fight for curriculum reform and the abolition of the aristocratic eating clubs. Wilson had been defeated by alumni conservatives, but he had won a national reputation in the process. Over fervent protests from progressives, Smith bludgeoned the state convention into accepting Wilson as the Democratic candidate for governor. Smith and Davis did not realize they were dealing with an idealist who was also an astute politician. Wilson soon became aware of the power of the New Idea philosophy among the voters, and he accepted the nomination with an impassioned speech, declaring that he was unbossed and pledged to remain unbossed. Wilson won a landslide victory. The new governor immediately went to work on an ambitious reform program. James Smith passionately desired to return to the United States Senate, where he had served a term in the 1890s. But Wilson refused to support him. Wilson also declined to deal on patronage with Smith's son-in-law, James Nugent, the Democratic state chairman. Before the bosses or the corporations knew what was happening, the Wilson-dominated legislature began producing reforms. An election law created a direct primary for all state officers. A Corrupt Practices Act promised stern justice for ballot-box stuffing and other notorious voting violations. A public utilities law gave a three-man board the power to regulate rates and limit franchises. A Workmen's Compensation Act gave laboring men and women financial protection if they were injured on the job. This tidal wave of reform made Woodrow Wilson and New Jersey national bywords for a new era. People began calling Governor Wilson a presidential candidate. Nationally, the Republican Party was coming apart. President William Howard Taft found it impossible to shed the old guard alliance with corporations and special interests. Theodore Roosevelt broke with Taft and announced himself as a third-party candidate on the progressive ticket. This Republican split meant that the man who got the Democratic nomination was almost a guaranteed winner. Wilson won the presidential nomination on the 46th ballot. With the New Freedom as his campaign slogan, he won the presidency as a minority candidate, running far behind the combined Taft-Roosevelt vote, even in New Jersey. In later years, Wilson was fond of remarking that anyone who did not get a complete political education in a year or two of New Jersey politics would be advised to seek another line of work.
Although Woodrow Wilson's gubernatorial candidacy received the support of influential blacks in New Jersey and other northern states, there was concern over his racial views and the racial practices of Princeton University while he was its president. Under Wilson's leadership, Princeton University was recognized as one of the leading institutions of higher learning in the nation. Yet President Wilson maintained a racist admissions policy against blacks. Black applicants were informed that they were not accepted to the university because of their race. Such a policy was not only a reflection of the social mores of the town of Princeton, which historically had links with the planter aristocracy of the South. It was also a manifestation of Wilson's own racial views. Born and reared in the South, Wilson accepted the region's views on race throughout his life. Although he rejected the most blatant forms of white supremacy, he believed that whites were the natural guardians of blacks, and he defended segregation as being in the best interests of both races.
During the last 30 years of the 19th century, a dramatic increase in organizing by reform-minded women took place in New Jersey. Women joined together in chapters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, in women's clubs, in women's assemblies of the Knights of Labor, and in local granges. These represented a significant population of middle-class and working-class women devoted to social reform.
New Jersey and Alice Paul became a major figure in the militant wing of the national suffrage movement. She was born in Moorestown, New Jersey, and raised as a Hicksite Quaker.
Paul graduated from Swarthmore College, Phi Beta Kappa, in 1905 and received a master's degree in economics and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1907. While in London doing graduate work, Paul became involved with Emmeline Pankhurst's militant Women's Social and Political Union and its crusade for British women's suffrage. She was jailed 3 times for participating in demonstrations and was force-fed when she went on a hunger strike.
Paul's story reached the New York and New Jersey newspapers immediately. The news value of local girl in Holloway prison was irresistible.
After her release and recuperation, Paul returned to the United States to her family's home, Paulsdale, in Moorestown. She worked on a doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, getting involved in suffrage activities in Philadelphia. She then moved to Washington, D.C., where she became a preeminent militant leader in work for the federal suffrage amendment. Despite the recent embrace of women's suffrage by leading New Jersey progressives, the cause was not part of the Democratic agenda. Wilson was equivocal and evasive on the issue. On February 13, 1913, shortly before he left office, Wilson succeeded in having a body of reform legislation, dubbed the Seven Sisters, passed by the legislature. On that same day, New Jersey suffragists succeeded in having released from committee a resolution calling for a referendum on a women's suffrage amendment to the state constitution. 2,000 suffragists and anti-suffragists filled the State House corridors, trying to buttonhole Wilson, who was on hand to push his own legislation. He eluded them before they could get a statement. The resolution was defeated because of alleged procedural errors. In 1913, New Jersey women went to Washington as part of an effort to press for a federal women's suffrage amendment. The 75 women who made up the New Jersey delegation had a special role as suffragists from Wilson's home state. Wilson, however, gave them the royal runaround. Frustrated, Alice Paul finally told Wilson's clerk that the women would come without an appointment and wait until the president saw them or refused to see them. In 1915, New Jersey women's suffrage referendum, for which suffragists pressed and then worked tirelessly to win, had national as well as state significance.
No eastern state had yet given women the full vote. If New Jersey could break this pattern, it might turn the tide for the state-by-state process.
The political endorsement that suffragists inside and outside New Jersey wanted more than any other was that of President Wilson. This he did on October 7, 1915, by saying, "I believe it should be settled by the states and not by the national government." Wilson thus finessed the pressure he was getting at the national level to endorse the Susan B. Anthony suffrage amendment to the federal Constitution. Tuesday, October 19, 1915, finally arrived, and voter turnout for the referendum in New Jersey was heavy. The suffrage amendment was defeated by a large margin, an undeniable statement by the men of New Jersey. After the defeat of the 1915 amendment, New Jersey suffrage organizations turned increasingly to the national scene.
Frustrated at every turn in her efforts to have the Susan B. Anthony Amendment carried successfully through Congress, Alice Paul embarked on a new tactic to put added pressure on Wilson.
They adopted the practice of picketing the White House. President Wilson finally accepted the necessity of women's suffrage, both for his own reputation internationally and for his party's sake. On February 10, 1920, New Jersey became the 29th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. New Jersey suffragists had achieved their first solid victory in their long history of organized struggle for the franchise. Years of education and agitation that transformed the nature of women's political involvement in New Jersey had finally brought results.
One of Woodrow Wilson's many reforms, the Walsh Act, provided Jersey City with the machinery to change from a mayor-council form of government to the suddenly popular commission plan. It was supposedly superior to the mayor-council form because each commissioner was directly responsible to the people for the operation of his department. The Catholic immigrants of New Jersey were looking for a man who would show them how to settle a half-century of scores with the native Protestants who had abused and oppressed them. They wanted a leader who would march them into political battle. They found him here in Jersey City. Frank Hague came out of the Horseshoe, that slum-ridden slice of downtown Jersey City christened by the Republican gerrymander of 1871. Perhaps the least known and most remarkable part of his astonishing rise to ruler of New Jersey was his early image as a progressive reformer. Hague went all out for the city commission reform measure, calling it an ideal way to get rid of an incompetent mayor. His chief opponent in Hudson County, H. Otto Whitpen. The voters approved the change in government, and in 1913, the voters elected Hague as police commissioner. Hague launched an all-out assault on police laxity. Hague's cops began enforcing for the first time city laws against prostitution and after-hours drinking. Police Commissioner Hague had literally cleaned up the city. In the municipal election of 1917, Hague ran a slate of 5 candidates, 4 Irish Catholics and 1 Protestant, and all 5 romped to victory. Hague was unanimously chosen mayor of Jersey City by the new commissioners. Having purportedly banished boss rule, Hague now went to work on other progressive targets, the utilities and the railroads. In 1917 and 1918, he increased the tax assessments on the Standard Oil Company and on the Public Service Corporation, the holding company that dominated gas, electricity, and inner-city transportation in much of the state. Under Hague, Hudson replaced Essex as the dominant Democratic county. Hague proceeded to consolidate his position by handpicking the next 3 governors of New Jersey. Scores of jobs that had been elective were placed under the governor's appointive power. There were more than 80 different boards and commissions, plus judgeships and 14 court systems at Hague's disposal. In 1929, the bottom dropped out of Republican prosperity on Wall Street. and the gray, dismal years of the Great Depression settled on the United States. As the private sector of the economy shrank under the impact of Wall Street's collapse, Frank Hague was transformed from a politician on the run to a titan with steadily swelling power. The loss of local tax revenue forced him to trim his city and county payrolls, but the jobs and money that flowed from Washington, D.C. more than made up this deficit in the patronage on which the machine depended. Hague won elections because he voiced the resentment, the deprivations of Jerseyans who had been denied a full participation in America's opportunities because of their religion or ethnic origin. He continued to win elections even after it became obvious he was corrupt, because he brought these people into the mainstream of New Jersey's political and economic life.
Blacks in the southern states, realizing the hopelessness of race relations there, sought to improve their condition through an exodus, a massive migration to the northern states.
They came to New Jersey between the two world wars in greater numbers than to any other northern state. Between 1910 and 1930, the black population of New Jersey grew by more than 132%.
Although the racial violence in the South was an important stimulus for migration, that region's economic backwardness was the primary cause. World War I interrupted European immigration to the United States and forced factory owners to find another source of cheap labor. Industrialists in New Jersey and other northern states sent agents to the South to convince agricultural workers there of the economic and social advantages of the North. The migrants obtained employment in New Jersey's industrial towns during the war, but the skilled trades remained virtually closed to them. Generally, they lacked experience in industrial labor, a disability which forced them into the least desirable and lowest paying jobs. Racial prejudice also worked powerfully against an improvement in their condition.
By the 1930s, many blacks referred to New Jersey as the Georgia of the North. Newark, the most populous city in New Jersey, as well as the industrial and financial center of the state, attracted more migrants than any other municipality.
During World War I, Newark bustled with activity. Race relations there were peaceful. The public schools were desegregated, and there was little evidence of white resistance to the increased enrollment of black children during the early years of the migration. After World War I, the migration increased, and efforts were made by property owners and real estate interests to restrict black settlement to the old working-class districts of New Jersey's cities. Several years before the Great Depression forced hundreds of thousands of people out of work in New Jersey, joblessness was a chronic condition for blacks. By 1930, most black city dwellers lived in distinct ghettos, notorious for their bad housing, poor health conditions, and poverty. The Depression gave considerable impetus to African-American demands for full equality in New Jersey. Blacks had been unemployed in proportionally greater numbers than whites for many years before the economic collapse, but the 1930s were especially difficult for them. As in other parts of the nation, blacks lost their livelihoods earlier than white workers, and they usually remained on the relief rolls longer. Blacks were attracted to the Democratic Party by the egalitarian philosophy of the New Deal, and beginning in 1932, they increasingly discarded their traditional allegiance to the Republican Party. By 1936, blacks made a dramatic reversal in their voting pattern, as a plurality of their numbers supported Roosevelt's re-election. Blacks also voted for local Democrats in larger numbers. The struggle against fascism in Europe during World War II reinforced the Black American struggle for equality in this country. In both struggles, the attention of the world community was directed against the dangers of racism and group subjugation.
When the United States entered the war on December 8, 1941, a profound change in American race relations was well underway, and the stage was set for the modern civil rights movement in the second half of the 20th century.